3, 2, 1. Liftoff.
Welcome back to the Ketamine Startup Podcast. This is where we talk about how to build a ketamine therapy practice, industry insights, and what's shaping the future of psychedelic medicine. I'm Kimberly Coe, and today's episode is a little bit different. Instead of our usual interview format, I'm coming to you solo with a news roundup. 4 stories that have landed in the ketamine and psychedelic therapy space recently that we think every provider in this community needs to be tracking. If you've been in the ketamine space for any length of time, you already know the main talking points of the Matthew Perry story. But in the last few weeks, the case has reached what feels like its final chapter in the courtroom. And the sentence that just came down is one we think every provider needs to hear. That's where we're starting today. I also want to talk about something happening in France that has real implications for how we think about standards here at home. A regulatory update of what's happening in Texas, and a federal executive order that just reframed how the government is thinking about psychedelic-assisted therapy at the highest level. 4 stories, all pointing in the same direction. But before we jump in, a quick reminder, the information shared in this episode is for educational purposes only and does not constitute medical or legal advice. Treatment approaches and regulatory compliance discussed should be evaluated with your specific practice context and regulatory environment. And with that, let's dive in. In April 2026, Jasveen Sangha, who became known in the press as the Ketamine Queen, was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to 5 federal drug charges connected to Matthew Perry's death. She was the central figure in the black market supply chain that prosecutors say ultimately fed Perry's escalating at-home ketamine use. To understand how we got here, a quick recap. Perry was found unresponsive in his Los Angeles home in October 2023. The medical examiner ruled his death an accident, with the primary cause listed as the acute effects of ketamine, with drowning, coronary artery disease, and buprenorphine as contributing factors. What the investigation revealed was that Perry had been receiving ketamine under legitimate medical supervision for depression, but he began sourcing much higher doses through an entirely separate, illicit network. By the time the legal dust settled, 5 people had been charged, 2 physicians, his personal assistant, and at least 1 other Hollywood-connected figure. Dr. Salvador Plasencia, a Santa Monica physician who admitted to distributing ketamine to Perry, was sentenced to 30 months in federal prison. Dr. Mark Chavez also pleaded guilty to conspiring to distribute ketamine, receiving 8 months at home confinement, 3 years of supervised release, and 300 hours of community service. And now, Sangha, at 15 years, is the stiffest sentence of the group. What strikes us most about this case, looking at it from where we sit in the ketamine therapy community, is how clearly it illustrates a risk that doesn't get talked about enough. This isn't a story about a rogue clinic or an outright negligence from the start. It began with legitimate physician-supervised treatment. The breakdown happened at the edges, where the clinical relationship loosened, where oversight thinned, and where a patient found a way to get more outside of a medical framework. And that is where things went wrong. Now, the courts, by handing out sentences that include practicing physicians, are sending a message that the field cannot ignore. When ketamine moves from a supervised clinical setting into an unmonitored use, the legal and ethical accountability does not disappear. If anything, the trail leads back, and it can lead back to a physician. Which brings me to what's happening in France right now. In March of this year, France became the first country in the world to formally authorize IV racemic ketamine for adults in severe suicidal crisis, not esketamine, not a nasal spray, the generic racemic IV formulation. And now it's officially recognized at a national level as a rapid-acting intervention for one of psychiatry's most urgent situations, imminent suicidal risk. For those of us in the ketamine space, the dosing parameters in the trials that supported this decision will look familiar. Roughly 0.5 mg per kg over 40 minutes, sometimes followed by a second infusion at 24 hours. But the dosing isn't the real story here. The story is the framework built around it and what may become of this. France's authorization is explicitly structured. Careful patient selection, continuous monitoring during and after the infusion, formal reassessment of suicidal ideation in the hours and days that follow. This is ketamine operating inside a high-surveillance psychiatric protocol, not as standalone treatment, but as a closely evaluated intervention with follow-up built in the start. Now, for our community, this decision is both validating and cautionary. And let's be honest about both of those sides. On the validating side, this is the same IV racemic formula that many in the medical community have been using off-label for years. And now it's getting formal national authorization and recognition in France. That is significant. It lends real medical legitimacy to this space. And that kind of credibility has a way of traveling into how regulators think, how payers think, and how the broader medical establishment perceives this field. But here is exactly where it gets cautionary. France's framework is narrow. It's limited to severe suicidal crisis in hospital-based settings with high surveillance protocols, while the U.S. ketamine therapy community has been treating in a much broader scope. Treatment-resistant depression, PTSD, chronic pain, other diagnoses, often in office-based practices with more flexible approaches. So the question worth sitting with is, could France's strict crisis-only framework become the template that regulators elsewhere point to? Could someone look at this and say, France proved this worked for suicidal crisis with these specific protocols, so let's require the same level of oversight for all ketamine therapy indications? Or even more restrictively, France authorized it for suicidal crisis. That's the only indication we should formally recognize. This is not hypothetical. That's the kind of reasoning that shapes policy, especially when the people drawing the lines don't have a deep familiarity with what's actually being treated in the ketamine clinics across the country. Organizations like ASKP3, the American Society of Ketamine Physicians, Psychotherapists, and Practitioners, are actively working to develop standardized protocols for treatment-resistant depression, chronic pain, and eventually more. France's move signals that the regulatory landscape is shifting faster than many anticipated. The validation is genuinely exciting, but the risk is real too. Regulations designed by people outside this community who may not understand the full scope of what ketamine therapy actually does could end up defining it far too narrowly. And speaking of oversight, let's talk about what's happening in Texas, because it connects directly to this conversation. If you were listening back in January, when I covered the Texas Medical Board's proposed ketamine regulations, here are where things stand today. As of late April, those rules are not yet law. The board published the proposed parenteral ketamine therapy regulations in January, ran a public comment period through February, and is now circulating a revised draft. A vote is expected in June of this year. What hasn't changed is the direction. The board is pushing for mandatory clinic registration, tighter physician oversight, strict monitoring standards, and a ban on in-home parenteral ketamine. The details may still be moving, but the destination isn't. What is significant about Texas, especially right after we just discussed what's going on in France, is that we're watching a state trying to define the floor. Not the ceiling, the floor. The minimum standard below which ketamine therapy simply should not operate. While France built a framework from the top down through a national health authority, Texas is building from the ground up through a medical board responding to real pressure in a real market. Different paths, same underlying logic. Unstructured ketamine use is no longer going to be tolerated, and providers who haven't been thinking seriously about documentation, monitoring, and oversight are running out of runway. Check out the show notes if you want a link to the original episode that covers the full context of what this proposed rule actually contains. And then at the federal level, something recently happened that reframes all of this, not just for ketamine therapy providers, but for the entire psychedelic-assisted therapy space. On April 18 of this year, President Trump signed an executive order titled Accelerating Medical Treatments for Serious Mental Illness. And regardless of where you fall politically, the policy content of this order is worth understanding clearly because it has real implications for this field. Here's the nutshell version. The order directs the FDA and DEA to fast-track research and access to psychedelic drugs for serious mental health conditions. It creates a right-to-try style pathway for eligible patients to access investigational psychedelic compounds under FDA oversight. It specifically calls out ibogaine for people with serious mental health or substance use disorders, and it directs $50 million through the Department of Health and Human Services and the Advanced Research Project Agency for Health program to match state-level psychedelic research investments, with Texas's ibogaine research program named as an early target. Now let's be specific about what this order does and does not mean for the ketamine therapy space. Ketamine isn't the center of the story. Psilocybin, MDMA-type compounds, and ibogaine are the primary focus. What this order signals, more broadly, is that the federal government is now treating psychedelic-assisted therapy as a legitimate medical frontier, not a fringe conversation. The administration wants Schedule I style restrictions rolled back as these compounds clear Phase 3 trials and gain FDA support, which accelerates conversations around recategorization and, of course, eventually reimbursement. For those of us in the ketamine space, the takeaway isn't that our world is changing overnight. It's that the regulatory and clinical standard conversation is no longer happening just at the clinical level or even at the state level. It's happening at the federal level now. Outcome tracking, monitoring protocols, documented results, these are becoming federal level expectations, not just best practices that thoughtful providers voluntarily adopt. Before we wrap up, though, I want to share one observation that connects a lot of what we covered today. As the FDA, DEA, and state boards continue to move in this direction, one pattern is becoming hard to ignore. The closer your clinic already looks like a REMS-style facility, the better positioned you are for whatever may potentially come next. If you're not familiar, REMS stands for Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategy. These are FDA-designed programs that ensure high-risk, high-impact drugs are administered in tightly controlled settings with strict eligibility checks, trained staff, continuous monitoring, and documented follow-up. This isn't a hypothetical framework. It already exists in our space, as ketamine Spravato can only be administered through FDA-certified REMS-compliant sites right now. That means clinics that have gone through this certification process already have the infrastructure, protocols, and documentation systems that regulators are likely to expect from future psychedelic therapies. So when you hear policymakers and researchers talking about building REMS-style frameworks for psilocybin and MDMA-type compounds, or maybe even some new ketamine-based products, they're not describing something that hasn't been invented. They're already pointing to a model that already exists in clinics treating Spravato patients today. So here's what I'd take away from everything we covered in this episode. Regulation is shifting towards structure, not flexibility. The clinics most likely to have a seat at the table in the future wave of FDA-approved psychedelic therapies won't necessarily be the biggest ones, perhaps, or even the most established. They'll be the ones that already look like regulated, accountable, REMS-adjacent environments where every patient is tracked, every dose is documented, and every risk is being actively managed. That's not good compliance. That's good future positioning. So to wrap it up, let's zoom out for a second, because I don't think these 4 stories are unrelated. A 15-year prison sentence for a black market ketamine supplier, and 30 months for a physician who lost the thread of what supervision can actually mean. A country on the other side of the world building the most rigorous ketamine framework we've seen to date at a national level. A state medical board drawing a hard line on what minimal standards look like. And now a federal executive order that puts psychedelic-assisted therapy on the official policy agenda. What connects all of these stories is accountability. The field is being watched, shaped, and in some cases prosecuted. And the providers who are going to come out of this moment well are the ones who aren't waiting to be told what good looks like. If you found this episode valuable, we'd really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps other entrepreneurial medical professionals discover these important conversations and grows our community. For complete show notes, links to the resources used to produce this episode, as well as a link to the episode that covers what the Texas Medical Board is proposing, visit ketaminestartup.com/podcast. And remember, this podcast is for educational purposes only and does not constitute medical or legal advice. Treatment approaches and regulatory compliance discussed should be evaluated within your specific practice contents and regulatory environment. Thanks again for listening to the Ketamine Startup Podcast, and we'll see you in the next episode.